I'm really excited to be here. My background is actually not very academic. My background is as a young kid from coal country who found himself in the big city and traveling around the world. And in those travels, I learned a lot. But in those travels, I also had a few missteps here and there. I spent some time homeless on the streets of DC, as well as being a commercial sex worker and an injection meth user. During that time, I contracted HIV, and it was then that I sort of felt a calling to kind of come into public health. There was an opportunity there for people living with HIV to be involved in the system, and I think I was bearing witness to the fact that the system really needed us. And I've become a real advocate for communities getting involved in government because I've had a very successful run sort of working in partnership with governmental officials. And I think government is not just at the federal level, and I'm not going to get too political, although I think it's a pretty safe audience. But I will say that change happens at the local level, and protection also happens at the local level. So no matter what is happening nationally, I think it's very important that we pay attention to what's happening in our backyards, because we have a lot of control over that. We wanted to start with just this sort of shocking statistic that we have around 37 million people living with HIV worldwide. When you start thinking about that, and the majority of that epidemic being centered in countries primarily in Africa and Southeast Asia, it's hard for us in the United States sometimes, I think, to see that for what it is and to think about that scale. We talk a lot about our domestic HIV epidemic, but I think it is a mistake to not think about the HIV epidemic for what it is, which is a pandemic, because it really shades our opinion and where we think the priorities are and where we need to put our dollars by only looking at what's happening in the United States. I talk a lot that this disease is behaviorally transmitted, but it is socially acquired. It is what you know and the networks that you sort of run with and engage with that help determine sort of your risk profile. But that knowledge has to be current. It has to be real, and it has to be based in evidence. I know you guys had a lecture, I think, yesterday on evidence-based information, and I'm a huge fan of evidence and science. But I think evidence is also limited when you ask the wrong questions. You can only get evidence if you're seeking out that answer. And so there are going to be times when we don't have evidence for what we're doing, and I think that's a tragedy. I think it means we need to have our researchers ask better questions. But I think if there are data and there is evidence, then I think we have to look to that. I talk a lot about, growing up in West Virginia where I threw science in the face of everyone around me. And I think now we have to stick to the science when we're talking about sex education and prevention. We don't get to just say what we've always said for 20 years because things have changed. And if we don't change with those things, then the people we're speaking to are going to know that we don't know what we're talking about, or that we're trying to convince them of our opinion and not give them an option or a choice in their own sexual health. Kids get information everywhere, right? And as we have learned, there is no short source of fake news everywhere and conflicting opinions about what people will say is true and about where young people and young adults go to get their information. But on the flip side of this, these young people will also go there and read new current information about how effective new prevention methods are, about how a condom is not the most effective way to prevent HIV for some populations anymore. And when they look and they see that information, and then you teach them that condoms are the best and only way to move forward, they are going to fact check you. Fear-based tactics are not new in public health. We have shamed people out of smoking for years, but it has not worked in HIV. It is proven time and time again, fear-based messaging not only doesn't work in HIV, but it actually makes the problem worse. We have data to prove that. So we really need people to think about the information they're putting out there. When I was trained as an HIV tester by the CDC, I distinctly remember buffet of options. That's what we're supposed to give people, a buffet of options, and they will make the choices that make sense to them, that fits their lifestyle, that allows them to have the level of protection they want in their sexual relationships, right? But if we choose to only pull off, the pudding, however good that pudding may be, they're going to miss everything else. Right? They're not going to know those things. And if their situation changes and a condom or other prevention method isn't working for them, they might think there's nothing else they can do. And that's how people end up getting infected, even when they want to protect themselves. The science is clear that people living with HIV with a sustained, undetectable viral load do not transmit the virus to others. And if like the agreement of the state directors isn't enough, Dr. Carl Diefenbach, from the director of the Division of AIDS at the National Institutes of Health, said, once you begin therapy and you stay on therapy with full virologic suppression, you are not capable of transmitting HIV to a sexual partner. That is epic, right? And when you look at this, where is that message? Where is that message to people in the community, right? That you need to be asking the people you're having sex with, are you infected with HIV? And if you are you on antiretroviral therapy? Are you engaged in care? Do you have an undetectable viral load? Because if you do, rock on, my friend, right? That's what I tell everybody, hang from the chandelier. I don't care, do what you want. As long as that person living with HIV has taken their medication, you can feel safe again, right? And you should feel safe again. Right? Now this, we always have to put a caveat, right? Like if you're co-infected with syphilis, if you are co-infected with hepatitis C, there are other diseases that can affect this statement, right? These are individuals living with HIV only, okay? So again, stay with the science. But at the end of the day, and in just a minute I'll show you, like we can treat a lot of other things, right? HIV is a lifetime of treatment, right? So think about comparative scale of impact there. Pre-exposure prophylaxis allows people to take antiretroviral drugs to protect themselves from HIV acquisition. In 2015, the World Health Organization released new guidelines and a policy brief that basically said individuals who are at substantial risk for HIV infection should be offered pre-exposure prophylaxis. And when you look down these lists of what sort of qualifies you for substantial risk, I think if you're a gay, bisexual, other man who has sex with men, you're automatically in the cohort, right? People have always thought that kind of sex was more dangerous as far as HIV is concerned, and we have data to show that it is. You are more likely to contract HIV in the kind of behaviors gay and bisexual men engage in than heterosexual couples, although as an HIV tester, I know what heterosexual couples do, and you're just as dirty as we ever were, you know? So when you look at these PrEP guidelines, it is a component, as I showed you before, of the National HIV/AIDS strategy, a rather large component of the strategy. And yet, I work in an infectious disease practice. We have 8 physicians. I've got 2 that won't prescribe it. Shocks me, right? Here I am in their office, out here talking about it all the time, and the exact phrase I heard, I'm not going to give those kids the candy they want to do whatever they want. Right? I had to put on my game face, and I was like, well, let's talk about the evidence, you know? When really I wanted to like rip her face off. But like, when you look at these things, I think we still have to convince people that this works, right? The science is clear that this is an effective way to prevent HIV. And we fought for fully comprehensive sex education programs on what? Science, evidence, that it worked. This works. This works really, really well when people adhere to it. And yet I've got sex educators who walk up to me and they don't believe in it. They're worried about sexually transmitted infections. They're worried about all of this. Well, you know what you need to be worried about is HIV. Everything else I can cure. We can work on everything else, right? I'm not saying it's not a big deal. I'm not saying that we need to take our eyes off the public health ball. But what I am saying is that when you look at HIV, it is a lifetime commitment to antiretroviral therapy. Right? It is a lifetime of commitment to medications that do have side effects, right? That over time can do damage to the body simply by keeping HIV at bay. I am all about full sexual health, but what I am not about is forcing communities to deny people in them an effective way to prevent this disease so that we cannot have to have other sexually transmitted infections. I don't think it's a fair trade, and I don't think the people living with HIV think it's a fair trade. There is something to be said about access to health care and improving that access and really making it a value. That it is not something that is pushed on us from insurance or something we do because our mom tells us, but we do because it's a value for our health, for our future, and for who we want to be in life. Because you won't be anything if you're sick. It's hard to kind of step up and step away from that, right? We can live with disease, but if you are suffering under illness, that is a difficult place to be. It is a difficult place, especially when that disease is stigmatized like HIV is. So with that, I would just say the last thing is to thank you all for the work that you do. As a person living with HIV, I know it is not easy to talk about these things. We talk about them all the time. We are your partners in this. We are the people who can stand for how important the work that you do is. And if there's anything we can do on the clinical side or on the community side to raise up your priorities and your issues, please communicate those to us. We are advocates. We have big voices. So with that, I will say thank you, and thank you to Jeff and the conference for bringing me here.